Push. Okay, good. I think we are going to start in 1 minute, maybe. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we can start. Possibly we'll still be receiving more attendees coming from the coffee. Thanks a lot for being here. It's the last round of sessions before the end of the day. It's been a long day, I believe, full of very interesting presentations and topics for discussion. But we leave the best for the end, which is the in-situ topic, which has been already, let's say, a quite of a staple and pretty much in all the EuroGEO workshops to discuss about the role of in-situ and the issues about how to overcome the access to in-situ data, which is so relevant for the production of Earth observation products and services. My name is Jose Miguel Rubio. Most of you know me, been in EuroGEO workshops for many years already. I work at the European Environment Agency. Now recently took over the role of coordinator of the what we used to be called Copernicus in-situ component. Now it's called cross-cutting access to in-situ data in the context of Copernicus program. No, cross-cutting coordination of Copernicus access to in-situ data. I need to say it correctly. That fits very well in the matter of the discussion today, which is about, of course, in-situ data is a huge topic. We could be discussing here about all the issues that we all have with in-situ data. We want to focus the discussion today in what could be the role or what should be the role of the EuroGEO initiative, the community in facilitating more availability, accessibility, and integration of in-situ Earth observation data. Why this session? If you've been in several sessions today, you have heard about all the issues that we have with in-situ data. It's, let's say, a key topic in all the different areas because it's still a limiting factor in order to exploit remote sensing data, which is so necessary for validating the products, for training the algorithms, also for CalVal of satellite imagery. So there is an issue of availability, there are issues about accessibility, there are issues technical and legal, even when the data exists. We have issues on interoperability, we have issues of licensing. I think things are evolving and we may discuss them later today, but there is a clear fragmentation and complexity in the in-situ landscape, but in Europe and in all the world. Of course, we will focus more in Europe here. And our question, as part as well of an activity that the EA is carrying out together with the InCase consortium, led by Evenflow, together with NOAA, CREAF, OGC, is try to see how EuroGEO can contribute to address these issues. What is the role of EuroGEO in this context? So that's why we wanted to bring in today in-situ data users, data providers, intermediaries to discuss experiences, challenges, and possible solutions. We will not have a lot of presentations. We asked only basically examples from three examples, three presentations. We'll also have the intervention of Phil Harwood representing the InCase consortium. And then we will have a panel discussion later on where we try to go in more detail and try to discuss a bit the key issues and how we can address them. So I will not go into more detail. You have here the agenda. I will ask the fellow speakers to try to keep to the time, because we really would like to have time for the panel discussion. Remember that this is being shown in Zoom, that we will be providing the PDF of your presentations. If you have any issue about that, let me know. And yeah, I can only now start by introducing let's say the first speaker, Stefan Fritz from EASA, a familiar face, so I don't think he needs any introduction, but yeah, he's been involved in so many projects related to land use, land cover, citizen science, yeah, and now you're going to speak about Evoland, right? So Stefan, if you want to come here.
Thank you very much, Jose Miguel Rubio Iglesias. You see, you pronounced my name so well, I can pronounce your name also very well. So thanks a lot. Maybe we get up this presentation. This morning we had some hiccups. It's very nice to see you all, a lot of familiar faces. Thanks for still being interested so late in the afternoon in this session. As we know, in-situ data is increasingly becoming absolutely critical because AI is moving really fast, and we can press a button now. If we have very good reference and in-situ data, we can really make a big difference. The training data is what matters a lot. I can use this, right? So let's see. Wonderful. So just to make us aware of the in-situ landscape and what is really the name for it. So it's many times used also for non-satellite data. Even LiDAR data is falling in sometimes in that category. And also the term reference data is being used, and I think for Copernicus and what Copernicus is doing, it has two meanings. On the one hand, these measurements, these traditional in-situ measurements of temperature, weather, and so forth, but also on topographic maps. And just coming back to the term reference data, I think we need more clarity on that term, because in the US, specifically when they are validating, they use reference data only for validation. So they don't call it validation data, but they call it reference data being used exclusively only for validation. This is clearly not the case in our understanding of reference data. So there's clearly a difference. And I think the definition has widened over time. Also, you know, the emergence of other tools, of crowdsourcing, of Internet of Things, and there will be many new sensors coming in the future, which will be probably termed then again in situ data. Coming back to Evoland, you've maybe heard already, or some of you, a presentation by Ruben this morning in the session where Evoland was more detailed explained. It's a very interesting evolution of Copernicus Services project, which has a strong also research component, responding to the new developments of automation and so the modularity of software and data products, the use and increased use of artificial intelligence, and the moving towards more near real-time monitoring and data processing. And there's lots of testing going on in Evoland, new methods, new tools, super resolution has been mentioned on 11 candidate prototypes places in the field of agriculture, forest, water, urban, and general land cover. These are the sites where these tests are being carried out over Europe, but also French Guiana and Cote d'Ivoire are test cases. You can see these are quite small areas which are being checked. For that we need also in situ data. This is the consortium is being led by Vito, and there's a lot of players within the Copernicus landscape, as you can see, also quite a lot of companies being involved. In this EvoLand project, the task is really to evaluate and further develop innovative data fusion, continuous monitoring, artificial intelligence, specifically also biomass mapping, and make use of novel EO and also novel in-situ data to improve and develop new products. In Europe and beyond as well. And there are some tasks around novel data, both observation, but also in situ and training data reflected then also in the deliverables. In particularly in EvoLand, we make use of a lot of European well-known data sets such as Lucas, LPIs, Eurocrops is really, really useful. Has I think 16 countries on crop information. National forest inventory data is critical, but it's not yet available in a lot of countries. There is really some need for access to those data and opening up of those data. Then there is a project also Yase is involved and leading, is called GeoTrees. There we provided also some data, but that's freely available, open biomass data, also preparing for the new biomass sensor from the Commission and Europe. Then some data from Toprisa and French Guiana, LiDAR specific data we use for Sweden. Then we use any data available, anything which adds value like OpenStreetMap, but there's also FluxNet, flux data, GPP data available, and that's also tested in this project. Specifically, we have quite good Swedish National Forest inventory data. Again, there are some issues somehow with the visualization. I don't know why. I had the same this morning. Anyway, as you can see here, Sweden is on the forefront of opening up this national in forest inventory data, and it's really setting a precedent and an example for the entire Europe to follow, because we can't really do good biomass maps with good reference and training data as well as validation data. Here are some examples of this GeoTrees. It's also going to become a geo activity, and there seems to be also further development of this platform, this GeoTrees. Another very interesting data set is Corda. Corda has a lot of topographic maps, on land monitoring, marine monitoring, atmosphere monitoring, emergency management, security, and climate change. I think it's a really good initiative. Unfortunately, it contains also data which is not accessible openly. This is because some countries, they simply don't want to share certain data sets, but it's a mixture between open data compiled in Corda and these national data sets. Well, we were, so thanks also to Jose, allowed to look at it, and it can be accessed by Copernicus players as well. We checked in these pilot cases what's really available, what could become relevant for EvoLand, and listed those, and there are some really interesting data sets in there, like tree species composition, for example, for Austria, and maybe very good also national forest maps and so forth. There is also sometimes there's digital data, but as you can see already, some is limited with the scale. So there is, of course, as with these topographic maps have a certain scale associated with it, which somehow then limits again the use for Sentinel-based 10-pixel kind of training data, for example. So there are some limitations also clearly in those. But we are also supporting EvoLand with our traditional kind of, whatever we call it, visual interpretation of very high resolution and time series data. You can see here our GeoWiki tool, where you can also see NDVI data over time, where you can see Sentinel time series. So there's also a time component to this. It's this tool where we try to access all other available very high resolution maps, but also other data. Also, we added planet data to this, and we then collect. This is just one example of a campaign we've run on the drivers of tropical deforestation, but this can be adjusted also to other needs, for example, in EvoLand or other projects on disturbance, for example, of forest management data can be collected through this tool, and many others. And we have been developing as part of EvoLand also a new tool which takes more care of the deep learning needs of machine learning, to classify larger areas and to create segments based on these initial features we get from Sentinel. And this you can combine and play around with these features and then create so-called clusters, which then create segments, and they can be straight classified. And on the lower right hand corner, you can then see already a classification which can then be submitted quite efficiently. Hopefully, once we develop this even further, is still a bit on an experimental level, as a label for water in this case, as you can see, right? So there is some new evolvement also on novel ways of collecting this kind of in situ data and making in machine learning ready. Another interesting tool we have developed is a Street View tool. It uses Mapillary or Google Street View, where you can directly, oops, that was a lot of glass, where you can then directly see the field and label the field, and you know where you are along the road, and then label, yeah, thanks, I'm nearly done, and then label the wheat field. In this case, most likely it's a cereal field for sure, most likely along those lines. And we also build a tool, an interface where you can then provide information on these classes. You know the date, you can really provide a lot of very useful information for crop type mapping using this tool whenever Street View and Mapillary is available. And last but not least, an app we've been deploying is called Crop Observe. It lets you go out to the field. It can be used by experts or by citizens to collect crop specific data. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. Really very interesting activity for us, particularly as part of the Copernicus Land team. We are really looking at what Evoland is preparing, because it really setting the roadmap for the future activities in this context. And it's also for us, but very important to know as well what are the different issues related to in situ data that can also be related to this evolution in the context of Copernicus Land. So we have here, let's say, the point of view or the example, the experience of Evoland as setting up the roadmap for a future evolution of an operational service. We'll have time for questions during the panel discussion. So I will just now invite Helen Glaves to give us, let's say, his point of view from the perspective of data providers. Helen Glaves, I don't think she needs any introduction, but yeah, she's a senior data scientist at the British Geological Survey, but she's also very important in the geo community as one of the co-chairs of the in-situ subgroup of the data working group, and many other hats that you have, which I can lose track. Please go ahead.
Thanks ever so much for the really nice introduction, Jose Miguel. For those of you who don't know me, I indeed do have a number of hats. I'm a geoscientist by background, and as already mentioned, I'm co-chair for the in-situ subgroup. But that's not actually the capacity that I'm going to speak in today, because one of my other hats is that I'm actually involved with the European Plate Observing System, which is a research infrastructure for the solid Earth. It's been mentioned a couple of times in other presentations today, but I'm also vice chair of the board of the European Environmental Research Infrastructures. Today I'm going to hopefully give a little bit of a flavour of the challenges for sharing data as we see them through the lens of the research infrastructures. But I am going to draw on some of the feedback that we received during the Open Data, Open Knowledge workshop in Geneva earlier this year, because we got a lot of really valuable feedback from data providers about what they think the challenges are in sharing data, but also finding and accessing data. So hopefully I'm going to give a little bit of flavour of both in this very short presentation. Let's see if I can make this work. I should also say that I have to thank Anke Heineler at FMI because Anke has co-authored this presentation with me. She would have loved to have been here this week, but she's not able to be here. So it's fallen to me to give our presentation. That was a bit quick. So I want to just start off by, we've talked a lot about the climate change crisis already in the last few days. So I'm going to use that as a starting point to say a few words about, firstly, about the role of the scientist, because data is fundamental for research. And in the hands of the scientist, data becomes information, it becomes knowledge, it becomes expertise and wisdom. And that's what's needed to address all of the challenges that are currently being faced by the planet, but also by society. And I think one of the fundamental tools that that scientists need is fair, openly accessible, and I've heard this said several times today, trustworthy, high quality and well-documented data and observations. And I think that's a message we've heard loud and clear in the last few days, because these are really important assets for capturing the complexity of the Earth system, but also making sure that we can better understand the interactions between the atmosphere, the solid Earth, or rather the land, and the ocean. And we've heard even now in the EvoLand presentation how important these observations are. But I think the urgency of tackling the climate crisis has actually highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary scientific collaboration as well. So it's not just about data quality, it's also about collaborating in ways that perhaps we're not used to. You know, many of us are very experienced in working within our own fields, within our own disciplines, and not so much with working with people in other disciplines, particularly things like social sciences, which increasingly we are needing to work with social scientists, but actually many researchers in the environmental sciences still think that's a black art that they really, they don't want to engage with. So what I want to do today is perhaps just say something about what are the challenges of sharing data. And I think one of the really important things to recognize is that we need to make data open and available so that it can be used in combination with data from other domains, including from the social scientists that some of us are quite terrified by. But we need to actually address specific research questions that mean we're changing the way in which we work. So this has led to there being really two types of barrier to sharing knowledge and information. And Jose Miguel alluded to some of these in his introduction, but they can be broken down into two types. There's the cultural challenges, and we've heard a lot about those today, which relate to the people and the practices involved in capturing, validating, and delivering the data. But there are also the technologies and the standards that are used and sometimes misused by researchers to capture, deliver the data and information. So what I want to do is perhaps just drill down a little bit. I'm not going to be able to say a lot in 10 minutes into some of these challenges, and then perhaps say a little bit about how EuroGEO and GEO can help with tackling some of these challenges. I don't want to go into them in much depth because I think we've already exercised some of these in the other sessions today. But one of the messages that came out very clearly from the ODOC workshop in Geneva, well, there's actually a lack of awareness and or adoption of open science practices. And there is still a challenge with getting researchers to make their data open and available. There are also varying standards of data stewardship, which limits potential reuse. And in particular, there are issues associated with how we assess the quality of the data, but also making sure that the data has a proper license associated with it. Because in fact, not having a license in itself is a barrier to reuse. If you don't know as a researcher what you can do with that data, you're just not going to use it. So this in itself, most people say, oh, well, it doesn't have a license, so I should be good to do anything. Actually, no, most researchers don't work like that. There's also a reluctance to share data because of the perceived value. If you as a researcher think, well, my next grant, I could also base my next grant application on the fact that I have this data and no one else does, it becomes a barrier to sharing that with other people. But another message we got from the EuroGEO Workshop is that there is a real concern that the originator of the data is not getting the recognition that they deserve, and this becomes increasingly problematic as data is used in combination to produce data products. So this in itself becomes a barrier. But also there is a concern that there is actually poor visibility of the data and services themselves. And so there's this concern that data providers are once again not getting credit, their data's not being reused. It's also worth saying that institutional and national policies, rules and regulations are still an issue. Many institutions, and I have to say, with the door closed, that my own institution is still struggling with the concept of open data because they still see a perceived value on holding the data and not releasing it so that we can generate the data products and sell them. That really is not an open data world. And I think it's also worth saying that in the context of the in-situ subgroup, we've been engaging with many of the GEO work programme activities. And one of the local challenges with regards to sharing of data is around, there are specific local challenges. So, for example, security of monitoring equipment. I had a conversation with someone in Africa who told me they have big gaps in their monitoring because their equipment's been stolen. And also, Stefan's just mentioned the challenges of resolution of data, and much of this can be related to protected species. The national level, there are rules and regulations around protected species, which mean data, locational spatial data, is restricted. And all of these things make some of this data unusable. Ooh, I went backwards, apologies. But there's also the technical challenges. I'm not going to, again, dwell on this. We've heard a lot about this already today in the various sessions. And I have to say, I was a bit boggled by the end of some of the sessions today, because I think the challenges are actually far more complex than even I'd recognised. But I think it's fair to say, if we want to boil them down to some generalities, it's around inconsistent or domain-specific formats, vocabularies, semantics, protocols, which all act as barriers to interoperability. There's a use of incompatible technologies and solutions. But there are also requirements for interoperability solutions to support inter and transdisciplinary research, and we're really struggling with that. And I think there's a lot of speciation, if we want to call that, in terms of the technologies that are being developed. And I'll come back to that in my closing remarks. 2 minutes, that's good, because I have about 2 minutes. Okay. So what I want to say, I'm going to digress slightly now from GEO, and I'm going to talk a little bit about ENVRI, which is the Environmental Research Infrastructure Cluster in Europe, because ENVRI is basically a coordinating activity which is aiming to reduce the heterogeneity in the data landscape in Europe. And this is being done by trying to have greater coordination and harmonisation of data, tools and services for the environmental research infrastructures in Europe. And so basically these environmental research infrastructures are based around life, air, land and water. And I mentioned EPOS, so EPOS is one of those. So really what the ENVRI cluster is trying to do is to make sure that all of the very large amount of data that's being curated, if we want to use that word, by the research infrastructures is being made as widely accessible as possible, and trying to address the challenges of interoperability at the domain level. You can imagine how challenging this is, because at the moment, I have to get the number right, we have 26 research infrastructures in the ENVRI cluster. And many of the RIs are very specialised in their own particular disciplines and domains. And so they are very much focusing on their core tasks to ensure they're catering to their specific user communities. However, the additional focus is on interoperability between the different research infrastructures. Obviously, I can't say too much about this in the talk, but if you want to ask me a bit more about the technologies we've been employing, then I'm more than happy to say a little bit more about this. But what I will say is the approach we've taken is about optimizing the resources to try and deliver tailored services and efficient operations to support research. I think this cluster of research infrastructures demonstrates how collective actions can resolve the technical and cultural differences. ENVRI hasn't fixed everything, but we've gone a long way down the road, so we are working very closely as a community. But I want to just use the last minute or so of this talk to say a little bit about how can GEO support efforts to really increase sharing of data, perhaps based on that collaborative model that the clusters of research infrastructures are using. ENVRI is not unique as a cluster. There are many clusters in Europe and in fact internationally. I'm going to get, I forgot that, got animation. That's what happens when I borrow slides from Anchor. So what are the key actions for the regional GEOs? And so obviously we're here in the EuroGEO Workshop. So one of them is promoting open sharing and reuse of data. This is quite fundamental, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but I think there is a role for EuroGEO in making sure that we are actually promoting good practices and good data stewardship. We need to be advocating for community standards, both at the regional and the global GEO level. We need to make sure that protocols and policies support interoperability and the creation of high quality data products. We've heard a lot about some fantastic things that are happening already. We need to be thinking about facilitating cross-discipline actions and discussions to identify common priorities for data sharing. So, for example, defining of essential variables. One of the things we heard in Geneva is many of the essential variables are common to different disciplines, and what's missing is the conversations between the different communities. So, for example, this is a fantastic slide that Anchor put together that demonstrates the collection of essential variables that GCOS have put together that are actually being adopted across a wide range of different communities. So these essential variables are not being used just in one area, they are being adopted more widely. And I think this definition of common variables is one of the conversations that EuroGEO needs to promote. Jose Miguel is looking at me because I've run out of time, but this is my last slide, Jose Miguel. The other thing that I think is important, the data providers are really concerned about the visibility of their data and services. There's a role in promoting those for GEO and for the regional GEOs, because the regional GEOs can make sure that in their areas, people are aware of what's available and what they can use. We also need to be thinking about gathering requirements for data, knowledge and information. Alba and Joanne have been working on the GREX tool, and if you didn't see the demo outside, if you're here tomorrow, please do ask them, because this is a perfect example of what GEO can do to facilitate requirements gathering. But lastly, I think the other important thing to highlight is that GEO and the regional GEOs can really support the GEO Work Programme activities and other related initiatives who are working towards integration. The one thing I want to highlight is many of the research infrastructures in the ENVRI cluster are participating organisations in GEO, but are not exposing their data via the GeoSport platform at this time. And EPOS is one of those, but we are working on that. But I think this is an important aspect of how the regional and the global GEO can really capitalise on the data that's out there. We need to get more of the research infrastructures involved. So I think my final message here is there's a lot here that the regional GEOs and GEO as a whole can be doing to improve and break down those barriers to data sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, it was great because we also got a summary of key outcomes of this in-situ session that we had at the Open Data, Open Knowledge workshop. And also it's good to really highlight the value of research infrastructures which are in many cases underfunded, and how they are contributing not only to science research but actually operations. So it's important to discuss and to see how EuroGEO could play a role here. Let's move on to Paolo Mazzetti. We have heard about data providers, let's say, research infrastructures. We have heard about needs for in-situ data from the evolution of a service. Now we are going to hear a bit the connection between both of them. Paolo Mazzetti, let me just my notes. Is a research scientist and head of division of Florence of CNR Institute of Atmospheric Pollution Research. Yeah, and he's involved in many projects. I mean, I lost control later, but also very importantly in the GeoDAP, which is at the core of the GEOS infrastructure, and many other activities. So please.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. Yes, in my presentation, I would like exactly to highlight a bit the role of data intermediaries to facilitate the interaction between in-situ data users and the providers. So the idea, let's say the messages that I would like to give is what is the role of intermediaries, including values, but also issues in introducing intermediaries in the, say, knowledge generation flow, and also highlight some previous experiences where actually the intermediaries are part and this role is actually put in practice. And also I would like to conclude showing how this role of intermediaries is already considered in the, let's say, in the great project, which is the preparatory action for the Green Deal data space. So first of all, I would like to highlight some of the many challenges of in-situ data sharing, where actually intermediaries can have a particular role. Helen actually already talked about the many challenges of in-situ data sharing. And also I would like to have a bit of comparison with the work already done in past decades about satellite remote sensing data, because actually if we look at the major challenges, they are the same, but actually in situ, in a certain sense, they are at a higher level. Because, for example, in remote sensing, let's say satellite-based remote sensing, they are mostly coverages, at least the most used are coverages, which means, for example, imageries. While, for example, in situ data sharing, we have a greater variety, including, for example, different types of data. And Stefan mentioned observation and reference data, but also many different feature types. We have profiles, we have trajectories, and so on. And of course, the usual heterogeneity in terms of formats, coordinate reference systems, resolution, and so on. Also, another big challenge is in terms of policy. And while on remote sensing data there was a long work, and in particular now we have a clear trend of free and open data sharing for public data sets, and also the commercial providers have a clear policy for distribution. This is not always true for in-situ dataset. Helen mentioned before that in many cases there is not a clear policy associated with in-situ datasets. And we have also many different cases. For example, in the research activities, there is often an embargo time required for publications. There are other aspects specifically related to the commercial value of some in-situ data. For example, some biodiversity data for fisheries are not provided because of their commercial value. And of course, there is the problem of privacy, for example, for some citizen science collected data. And also there is a big impact, as again Helen mentioned, of the new regulations on data sovereignty, data privacy, data ethics. Also in terms of accessibility, there is quite a big difference, because while remote sensing data are commonly distributed by the producers and owners, and also many existing clouds provide a large collection of data sets. In the in-situ dataset, the scenario is a bit difficult. There are also small organizations, including small research centers, which don't have the possibility to manage their own repository. So we have big problems of accessibility of many valuable data sets. So how intermediaries can help this? Data intermediaries are third parties that mediate between data producers or providers and the data users. And actually, they work at different levels. They could be just the organization acting as intermediaries, or they may have also tools facilitating the interaction. And you can see, I don't know if the pointer works, the situation without the intermediaries and the situation with an intermediary. So for example, one activity where intermediaries can be useful is on the harmonization of metadata and data. Actually, in many aspects. One is on reducing the complexity, because without intermediaries, you need to have M times N agreements between the users and the providers. And actually, all the burden of interoperability is upon either the producer or the user. While with an intermediary, you have smaller complexity, because you need only M plus N agreements from each provider and each user with the intermediary. And also you can apply the so-called separation of concerns pattern, which means that you have one element that is dedicated to interoperability. So you set free producers and consumers by most of the interoperability issues. And actually, another interesting aspect is that the intermediary can provide added value. So for example, you could provide something like metadata augmentation or any kind of transformation during the transfer. Of course, there are also drawbacks. For example, since this is done at level of intermediaries, in some cases, the, let's say, harmonization can be suboptimal. For example, it's very interesting, the case mentioned by Helen is in multidisciplinarity, but often it could be suboptimal for intra-community, but it could be very fine solution for multidisciplinary interoperability. And of course, you have multiple transfers, which is another drawback with intermediaries. And another potential drawback is that you have a logical single point of failure. If the intermediary actually doesn't work, the interoperability becomes not possible. And but also another potential role for intermediaries is to providing open repositories for addressing this challenge that I mentioned before of data, in-situ data which are not accessible. So we have at least a couple of experiences where we personally in CNR were involved, where actually data intermediaries have a clear role. One is GEOS, where most of you know there is a GEOS platform which is based exactly on this mediation approach. The GEOS platform has different components. I would like to focus on the technical interoperability provided by the GeoDAB, was mentioned by Helen in the slides, so thank you. And the GeoDAB is a broker, is a mediator, which actually implements a tenth of different specification and profiles to connect currently more than 200 data infrastructures and data sources. So they are heterogeneous, but they are harmonized by the discovery and access broker. It supports standard, but also legacy and proprietary interfaces exposed by these infrastructures. And on the other hand, it exposes standard interfaces and APIs to connect the different clients, including the GEOS portal, the community portals. And doing this, actually, it provides also some value-added services. It provides the possibility of transformation, which means reprojection and resampling, reformat, and so on, and bulk download. So collecting data from different infrastructures. In GEOS, we have several satellite-based remote sensing data, but also some in-situ data collections. Another example based on the same technology is the WMO hydrological observing system, which is actually implemented in 3 regional systems, Plata, Arctic at global level, and here most of data are in situ, coming from monitoring stations, and we supported multiple clients with these APIs and interoperability with the general WMO information system. As I said, I would like to mention that we consider the role of intermediaries in the, let's say, preparatory action for the Green Deal data space through the GREAT project. Some of you were already in the session on GREAT. Just to mention that GREAT is considering data intermediaries already at the governance level as one of the actors categories. And also in the technical blueprint, we considered some logical building blocks that we call the facilitators that can be provided exactly by intermediaries for addressing some of the challenges that I mentioned before. And so going to the conclusion, in-situ data sharing challenges are similar to those that were already addressed for remote sensing, but at a higher level. Based on these previous experiences, intermediaries can help to address data interoperability challenges, of course, with some issues, in particular in terms of governance of having new actors involved in the data sharing. We don't see major technical issue, mostly due to the work done by the community in defining their own community standard, for example, and adopting, for example, mediation for multidisciplinary interoperability. And major issues are actually in terms of governance and sustainability problem. That's all.
Thanks a lot. We will discuss in a few minutes a bit more. I think it will be interesting to hear a bit as part of the GREAT project, what is a bit more your views about the in-situ context, and also what do you think will be the impact of the high-value data sets as well, which I think it will be very important for this community, how this will proceed and how this will evolve. But before going to the panel discussion, I want to introduce the last presentation of today, which is done by Philip Hargood, who's a consultant at Evenflow, who has a very long experience in the space industry, and he's involved in also a number of projects, Evoland, for example, and also assisting the EA in our in-situ activities.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very brief. This is not really intended so much as a presentation in its own right. It's more of some seed questions to get the discussion going in a minute when we move to the panel. Just as a background, so I'm project manager for the InCase project. This is actually supporting EA in supporting the Commission in order to support the work of GEO. For the most part, we are focused on supporting GEO, but we have one particular task, which was to look at how EuroGEO could potentially serve as a facilitator in the context of the complex European in-situ data landscape. This is just a slide to show different in-situ initiatives within Europe. I think there's nothing here that we haven't already discussed. I've used a slightly different terminology, data brokers instead of intermediaries, but other than that, I think it's more or less standard. We've talked to several people, including many of the people I see here, about what the common issues are around the sharing of data, both from the user side and from the provider's side. I'm not going to read all this out because I think it's very much duplicating what has already been said by the previous speakers and in other sessions of this. So what I would like to just focus on very quickly is the question, what could EuroGEO potentially do about this? And we've tried to summarize this into 4 potential recommendations, which I throw open to the panel in a minute. But one obvious action is simply to capture all these disparate user needs and capture all the data in order to facilitate matching between the needs and the data that are out there. This is something that Joan and Alba have already started within the GREX tool, and it would be a natural evolution of the work that is done there. Another action that EuroGEO can potentially make is to, on the repository side, ensuring a suitable repository for providers. Again, GEOS is already something that is supported here, but obviously it's not perfect. Helen mentioned that EPOS doesn't make their data available through GEOS, so there would need to be some sort of feedback mechanism in order to understand the needs of the providers and what are these blocking points, and give the input to the repositories. Similarly, the actual providers of data may need help in figuring out how to get their data onto the portal. Another potential action that EuroGEO could take, we've mentioned different data sharing policies, different licensing conditions, and this is again something where EuroGEO could potentially help, giving some specific templates, some specific examples that people can take and use. This would need to be enforced. Somebody would have to make sure that these templates are used, which would mean that the funding bodies would need to be involved here. And finally, we're all here, we're all talking together, and I think this is the final action for EuroGEO: provide a forum for key players to coordinate actions, either as a less focused session like the one we're having, or as a more focused action group, where we can bring the users, bring the providers, bring the data brokers together in order to talk. It would need to be seen again by the organizations as something with real value, not just a talking shop. Those are some potential actions that we can discuss in a few minutes. One thing I will throw open is a couple of open issues as well to be discussed. One is, who is this being done for? And EuroGEO is the European contribution to GEO, but then there are also some specific European issues that need some degree of coordination, like the Green Deal data space. So where is EuroGEO fitting in here? Are we fitting in primarily as the input to the global GEO, or is this more of a European action addressing European problems? And then the final one, which is, again, for discussion, there are so many initiatives, there are so many working groups. Where is EuroGEO really adding value, and where is it just adding an extra level of complexity onto what's already recognized as a very complex ecosystem? So I don't have the answers, but I'm throwing open the questions, and I think Jose can now pass over to the panel to discuss these points.
Perfect, Phil. Indeed, we will be discussing these questions and other questions that we have prepared. What I will now ask is the panelists to sit here. I will just move to the pulpit. Also, I would like to invite Nuria Castell and Elnas Ninavas to sit as well with us. So the idea is to have a kind of a round discussion. We have prepared some questions, but of course also feel free to put questions. I have a few to warm up the discussion, but first I would like to give the floor to the two panelists which have not spoken yet. I will first give the floor to Nuria Castell, who is a senior scientist at NILU, who is working in air quality and also is working particularly in the context of citizen science. I would like just to ask you for a couple of minutes just to introduce yourself. Also, how do you see in particular the context of citizen science data, in-situ data, coming from citizens in this overall, let's say, landscape, and also a bit feeding into what we have been discussing today.
Thank you. So my name is Nuria. I work at NILU in Norway, and I'm coordinating the group there on technology and society. And my research interest comes also in how to use citizens' data, how to make it more uptaken, how to enlarge the uptaking of data. And I've been listening to these talks today, and I see like there's like many points that are common also with the citizen science data that is also common to this other in situ data, like interoperability, the necessary of standards in order to guide the people how to use this data. But there are also other issues that are very characteristic of citizens' data, citizen-generated data. And some of the particularities, for example, they were saying, Helen was saying, like, we need high-quality data. And here, citizens' data is not always perceived as high-quality data. However, it still can help us a lot towards the challenges we are facing. So we need to somehow change some mindsets here on the use of citizen-generated data by the scientific community. Other of the issues also is like how to acknowledge. You were saying like we need to acknowledge the data providers, right? But how we acknowledge citizens. We have like a plethora of citizens that are contributing with their own sensors. How to acknowledge that. Another of the issues that was also mentioned is like also like how this data and the GDPR and the privacy and the security that is tackle very different points when we talk about citizen data. So some common issues, some also very particular, and we hope GEOs can help us here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nuria. Definitely, I could see, I mean, having also been linked to the citizen science community, let's say, with following up all these citizen observatories, that the EuroGEO has, I think it could be a very good forum, let's say, to discuss all these issues about standardization, or at least making sure there is interoperability, providing guidelines, because I don't think there is really a forum, let's say, or any other place. Of course, there are associations, the European Citizen Science Association, which is working also on this type of activities, but in the context of Earth observation and how this can support, I think EuroGEO could be a very good place to discuss these issues. I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Elnaz Neinavaz. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty of ITC in the University of Twente, and she's been also involved in several geo-related projects. I would just like to give you the floor also to provide us with some feedback on how do you see as well that EuroGEO could play a role also in the context of the activities that you are doing at the university. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentations. I just want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Elnaz Neinavaz from ITC. I'm assistant professor. I'm very much involved in retrieval of essential biodiversity variable using geodata. But the struggle is real when we come up with using in-situ data, particularly at the larger scale. At the local scale, we are always reliant on networks, or we do our own fieldworks and collect our own situ data. But when we want to scale up and come up with the global products, we always have an issue. But what I found here during these sessions that since late 2016 that I'm involved in particularly Horizon project, I see that the points that raise here is repeating. So more or less we are struggling for past 6 or 7 years, and we are talking about the same thing again and again and again. So I haven't seen the solution yet to how we have to address. Even I was involved in one Horizon Euro project that very much was in system of using in-situ data that we never ever received, and eventually we contacted our collaborator from our network to come up with the in-situ data. So we have to be a little bit more proactive from the presentations that I just heard here, that we have to echo these issues by talking more, by emphasizing based on law, or come up with the new regulation, I don't know, but we have to do something for that. We need in-situ data. This is not the issue that will gone quickly. All of us in this room, I'm sure that in some part of our work, we always rely on in-situ data to calibrate or validate our products. So it is with us for a while. So we have to really find a solution.
Indeed, I was going to say something similar before, that I feel a bit like kind of a, well, I don't know how to say in English, but this state that repeats again and again and again. Because we keep speaking, yeah, voila. We keep speaking about the same issues. I'm not quite on the same page in the sense that we don't do anything. I think, well, I can speak from with my hat of lead of the Copernicus in-situ component, or the new name, that we really, I think we are advancing. It's really, I would say, a bit of a painful work. At least I can speak in the context of the Copernicus program how much we have been working with networks. For example, I can speak about the EuroGeographics, which represents the national mapping cadastral agencies in Europe, with whom we have signed recently an extended agreement. So Copernicus services can get access to data from the national mapping agencies for production validation of the products. It's a step forward. It's not, we are not speaking about open data, but we are at least making sure that this data is available, at least in the context of Copernicus. The same with EUMETNet. We also have a framework agreement. Yeah, I would definitely think that we are progressing, and I think the regulation on the high value data set, that, in my opinion, will be a clear, let's say, turning point on getting access to this, to a large number of geospatial, environmental observation, statistical data, meteorological data. Now, how the member states will implement this and take into account that this only applies to EU members. But we hope we set a blueprint for other countries to follow suit. I would like, can you put the slide of Phil again? Because I would like to go back to the suggestions that Phil had in the slides. Is this just the last one? Yes, because I would like to, before I ask more questions, maybe I should give the floor to you. If you have any burning question, otherwise I will just proceed to warm up more discussion. But if there is anyone who would like to react on the, yeah, Franz, please.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for this. Working? Yes. For these nice presentations and for this discussion, which I think is a very interesting one, and the points you've raised are very pertinent questions. So I really like to engage in the discussion, but to ask a question or to raise one point is about these intermediaries, which I think is a very, very relevant aspect, and I do believe there's need for intermediaries, and actually I like the word much better than a system of systems or something that is on top of all the others, but something that really connects dots. And I was missing a bit in the discussion we had in the previous session on the data spaces, the role of these intermediaries that is actually mentioned in the data space regulation. And we have not really touched this point, that's why I want to raise it, is this question of trust, which has actually two sides. One is for the users of the data, they go there and they trust that the data has a certain quality probably, or that is reliable data, so that's the one side. But there's also another side, which is from the suppliers. They trust that the data there is handled in a proper way, and there's now more and more with IoT things coming in. There's GDPR questions, there's data privacy questions that have become very important, and there's actually the big role, I think, of the media what I call intermediaries in the data space. Of course, there's also another question of trust, which is, and that's, I think you raised the point, is that I've given my data there, they're not kind of rebranded, and I don't have any visibility anymore, and somebody uses the data and doesn't know that where the data originally comes from. That's also an important aspect.
Thank you.
Yeah,
May
please,
I?
Paolo, yes.
No, I think you touched at least a couple of important points. One is twofold dimension of trust. In the data space, not just the Green Deal data space, there is a lot of focus on trust in terms of transfer of data. So to be sure that the organization involved are authorized on that exchange. But as we were discussing now, there is also the aspect of having reliable information, which is, I think, very, very important. And I would like also to answer to Nuria about the quality of citizen science data. I think probably in many cases, quality is, of course, lower than those coming from organization. But what is important, I think, is to document the accuracy and let the users to decide if they can consider them reliable, depending on the specific use case. And on the other aspect, that is how we envision this role in the data space is also twofold. I mentioned it a bit in the presentation. One is in terms of actors. So in the governance aspects, we considered the three main, let's say, actors as the providers, the users, but also intermediaries. And that's part also of the general idea of the digital ecosystem, which is exactly on allowing stakeholders to contribute with, for example, new technologies that can help to bring things together. By a technical point of view, we are more involved, of course, in the technical aspects. We introduced this concept of facilitator, which is exactly the idea to have logical components that can help providers on one side and users on the other side. So that's basically the idea, that perfectly agree that intermediaries have a big role.
Thanks. You want to, please. Go ahead and bring it in.
I just want to quickly add something. In a previous life, I did a lot of work on interoperability between different marine research infrastructures around the world. And one of the biggest challenges was interoperability. And I don't know how long the GeoDAB broker has been around, but that was, at that time, was seen as groundbreaking, but seen as essential to actually address some of the issues of interoperability. It was mentioned here that we keep coming around the same questions, but I think some of the solutions have been around for quite a while. I can't remember when the GeoDAB first...
2012.
Yeah, something like that. That would be about right. Yeah, that would sound about right. But I think it's important to recognize that this concept of intermediaries is something that has been recognized, has a real value for some time. I also wanted to quickly comment on Nura's mention about citizen science as well. I think there is this preconception that citizen science is not of high quality as research data. But I think the real question is, how do we handle citizen science? And I've been involved in a number of conversations around assigning confidence to different types of data to allow users to evaluate whether they want to use that data. So it's really just a quality flag. But where there are clear gaps in the data, that might be the only data that's available. So it's actually about giving the user all of the information they need to make valid use of that data, whether it's high quality observational data or it's data that is perceived as being of lower quality because it's, let's not call it citizen science because I think it's a much broader field. It's collected by non-experts because I think there's also some other marginal data as well.
There are a number of words and terms which we should not get into that now.
Yeah.
Just one example concerning citizen science. We are in a project where ECMWF was providing a repository for citizen science, And we had a stop basically of that activity for some months because they were not sure that they were enabled to redistribute those data according to the GDPR. So that's also a problem related to policy.
Yeah, licensing is always an issue, and that's why documentation, well, having worked with metadata for many years, I know how important is that. Stefan, and then I don't know if someone has questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. No, I just would like to raise 2 points. They are quite different though, but just coming back to the citizen science data, since we touched upon that topic, I think we have to be very careful that we don't come up with some general rules like the data is not as good as expert data. I would say it really always depends, and where we can agree upon is that it for sure varies a lot depending on the application. So, you know, we can have passive data collection, we can have like sensor-based citizens data. So it's not the citizen, it's the quality of the sensor which matters, right? So a PM sensor is put somewhere, it measures the PM at that location. If the sensor is good, the citizen science data will be good. If the sensor is bad, there might be some relationship to where it's put, how it's put, how it's dealt with. That's correct. But there is also this component of the sensor quality. But also I think we have to not neglect the training aspect. So what we've seen is that if you train citizens over time, and if you have a close meshed monitoring by experts, and you have a close interaction between experts and non-experts, the non-expert can get as good as the expert eventually, and it's a time question. So I think just this, I think is very important in that respect. But coming back to the more important question we are discussing here, and this is really access to data, and we've seen that in many different presentations, really interesting barriers you've kind of pointed out, which I fully agree are really there, and it's many times related to competitiveness. So the scientist doesn't make it available because the scientist wants the next grant or wants the science paper, by the way, the high-level Nature paper. That's why a lot of researchers don't make data available, because they only can do it. They are the only ones who have exclusive right to amazing data. That's still a big problem. But the solution, I think really part of the solution is what you have mentioned, is on the donor side, you know, really educating the donors, because many times the donors, they have no idea. Philanthropists, I'm not saying they are bad, but they are not really diving deep enough into the importance of specifying in their calls that all data produced in that project has to be open. And that's not enough. It has to be followed up, and there needs to be people checking if it's really done what is promised. And there needs to be really data, whatever, on the side of the donors. There really needs to be people who do the checks. If the data promised is then also available, and ideally you want to even already say where the data can be stored, where the repository is, where the data should be put, and the more guidance you can provide from the donor end, the more clear you will be on how much data you will get. And you will also remove the competitiveness automatically, because indeed, you know, we are a little bit in a difficult situation because we have Copernicus. Copernicus is mainly to 80% carried out by company. If I'm a company, I think competitively, I generate myself as a company in-situ data. I will not share it. Why should I? Because another company can take up this in-situ data and generate equally good products I do. So as my commercial interest, if I want to stay at the forefront, I would not share the data. Why should I? So if the donor makes it clear from the beginning, this grant comes with an automatic delivery of all data, or even the whole workflow of the generation of the maps needs to be open and transparent. One example would be, for example, ESA's World Zero project, where also we've been involved. The data is open, the workflow is open, the algorithm is open, everything is anyway open. Yeah. Then it's clear, and we have part of the solution. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's give the floor to, I would also have things to say on that. I think we are also, in Europe at least, trying to push for that in the context of the Horizon program. Marie-Françoise, and then we will go to Restis, but yeah.
Well, on what has been said before, in the systems I know, On the operational real-time systems, most of the time there is an intermediary that at minimum re-encodes the data into an homogeneous format to allow a faster processing afterwards. But they also sometimes implement some consistent controls on the values, because for in-situ you can have a lot of errors. So these are the things you can do at the intermediary level. And also, well, there was something else. Yes, and also for the data privacy, they can implement some anonymization or fuzziness on the geolocation, things like that, in a consistent way over all the data they centralize in the hub. In the research context, what we have seen in EuroGEOs and then in eShape is that the data providers are very sensitive to be credited correctly. So even if there is an intermediary, the source of the data should be credited correctly. This is very important, I think, for the grant of the providers. On what you said here, I also had a comment, but I don't remember now.
There are so many things to comment.
It will come back.
Yeah.
But on the citizen science, I agree with you that usually they are of good quality, better than we think, because the people who do that are passionate and they have some scientific, either some passion for what they do or some scientific background. And usually the citizen science data I heard about, the scientists were quite positively surprised by the quality of the data, including, I remember a presentation on long series and data rescue, where people to calibrate some long series for climate change had looked for data from 300 or 400 years in the past, and they were amazingly surprised by the quality because it was collected by scientists. Oh, yes, and you were talking about, well, never mind, it will come back.
Yeah, don't worry, thanks. I think we wanted also Orestes. I just don't want to complete the session without having a look again at the role, let's say, of EuroGEO in this context. That's particularly important, I mean, I think for the whole community, for us also in view of the new project that will start on the Secretariat, we would like to support them as well in giving some recommendations. So yeah, I would like to come back to them, but Orestes, please.
Yes, sometimes when you want to make a party, you know, and you start discussing with all the people in the room, it's very hard to arrange a party. So perhaps you need a critical mass of 2 or 3 people to just go ahead. This means that perhaps we shouldn't be trying to convince every in-situ provider out there. Perhaps we should first focus on the ones that really want to contribute, and they cannot. They don't know what a data catalog is. They have their local XLS files in local PCs, and you know, that's it. So this is a culture that has been going on for a long time. So perhaps we should focus first our efforts on the people that want to provide but don't know how to do this. So this is my first point. I was wondering regarding the European data spaces, there is a lot of talk of data sovereignty. You already mentioned this. If we can make sure that a car driver, he's sovereign of his data and the Volkswagen won't use it in such a manner, is there a technical solution? Is there a policy solution that we could steal from the 2020 strategy, digital strategy of Europe, to bring in here regarding legacy, I don't know, or a technology, blockchain, I don't know, to ensure the legacy? So this is my second point. And the third is the C-squared. We talked about this yesterday. The Copernicus in-situ has a fantastic database. The GREX is kind of an expansion of this, is a geo expansion, let's call it like this. Does this room know of this database? If not, perhaps, you know, this is an issue for EuroGEO. Perhaps we should rebrand actually Geo and put an asterisk, not only remote sensing data, but this is, yeah, a small thought. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I will give you the floor just about 2 of the things, then I will give you the floor. Yeah, with respect to the first thing, little by little, or first, I agree. I mean, I think this should be linked to which kind of use cases we are focusing on, and I mean, we really need to focus. The in-situ data landscape is extremely wide, and yeah, with respect to the CS square, which stands for Copernicus In-situ Component Information System, which is basically a database of requirements for in-situ data for the Copernicus products. It's a very, let's say, technical tool, very focused on which kind of data, which kind of requirements, in-situ requirements need each of the products of the Copernicus portfolio. And we have used this as a blueprint for GREX, which I would believe that could be a very good contribution as well from the EuroGEO community to Geo and EuroGEO. But of course, we need a clear use cases there or target, let's say, focus to work on that. And that's why, for example, now in the context of the in-case project, we are focusing on a few Geo work program initiatives to discuss with them which kind of issues they have. Now, what we need to know, and I look at the, let's say, in-situ data users, is like how useful this could be. And that's something that we could discuss. But I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, so I actually, I'm going to follow on from what you've just said, actually, Jose Miguel, and respond to Orestes, because one of the things we're working on at the moment with the Geo Secretariat is it became very clear from conversations we had within the ENVRI cluster that the reason that many of the research infrastructures are not exposing their data via the GEOS portal is because they don't know how to. So we are currently developing a use case using the European Plate Observing System to demonstrate how to do this, because one of the issues for some of the data providers is exactly what you highlighted, Orestes, that they don't know how to actually be a GEOS data provider. But I think the role for EuroGEO here is the reason that connection was made with EPOS is because I have a role in a research infrastructure and I have a role in GEO. So what we need to do now is find out who are the other data providers who actually would very much like to deliver their data via GEO, but they don't know how to. And I think that's probably a role that that's a space for where EuroGEO can be active as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Paolo and then Elna.
Yeah, very, very shortly concerning this, what you said about becoming a data provider in GEO. I must say that some years ago, we had a very good support from the GEO Secretariat. They actually reached out to the communities, helped them to start the procedure, and then they contacted us. I must say that this support was basically ended. So now we are often contacted directly, and we have to follow the inverted procedure. So we redirect them to the GEO Secretariat for the formal application. So I agree that EuroGEO could do this at least for the European providers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just quickly, because as a researcher, I responded to this concern that the researchers don't want to share their in-situ measurements. That's correct. There is a culture between researchers that they don't want to share their data, or even when they share it, they do in a way that you cannot use it. I personally have this experience, but on the other hand, I have a sympathy that when they do the hard field work, they trained for months to use certain instruments. They do for a couple of months to the fieldwork to collect the data, and they process the data for a couple of months. They don't want, like this, share the data with the community. But I think that we have to work on it. There is solutions that provide some deadlines. If your researchers cannot provide the scientific paper after 5 or 6 years, it means that she or he cannot. So there should be some time window for them, that after a certain time they share this data with the community. It just came to my mind, and I'm thinking for a while about that. But this is a real problems that even the researchers, when they want to, they know that other researchers have certain data. They struggle to convince them to share those data with them. But on the other hand, there is some responsibility toward the Commission as well. Commission funded many initiatives. Some of these initiatives, they collect the data, but still these data that the provider obliged to share with the community is not shared. So the monitoring of these sharing systems should be take it seriously. Even some research project or grant that the PI received €1 million, that is still with come up with different excuse to postpone this data of sharing. Yeah.
I don't know who was first.
So I can make it very quick, and it is very short.
And then we go to.
So going back to what Stefan said before, and addressing the comment you've just made, I think the publishers are now going to take a lead on this. I'm an editor for a geoscience journal. I'm also vice president of EGU, and we have just instigated a no data, no publication policy. This is going to become increasingly the common practice. It means if you don't publish your data with the journal article, you won't get published. And I know Nature is now also going in the same direction. So I think the publishers will force the issue.
Exactly. These are really excellent points, those the ones you're making. But I do remember there is still the option in Nature. I think maybe they will take away, but there is still the option which a lot of researchers use, and this is data sharing by email. Then they provide the email, and you will never get an email from that person.
They're getting rid of that. They're getting rid of that.
Except, so that's great, but except, and that was common practice, and that's the additional practice researchers use. They want to be on the paper, because what's the incentive of a researcher now? You're measured still by impact factor, and this is a big problem. We need to get rid of being measured by impact factors, because the more publications you have, if you give your data out, you will do it on the condition that you're an author of the paper, and that's a big problem in the research field. Just to complete the full story.
Also there
so
is a
use the microphone.
Exactly. So we need. I finish. So we need other incentives. They are changing. So this is great. We need to get rid of the impact factors to some degree, or measure it differently. And we need to create another incentive, which is when you actually share the data, then you are acknowledged in another way, and you get kind of brownie points, bonus points when you share the data. So we need to change the current incentives for the researchers.
Very shortly, and then we go to.
At that point of the publishing the papers, there is a legal issue behind that, and this is even discussed between researchers, because many times some of this data is not our data. It's handover from the collaborator, and we are not allowed to share it, even though we want to publish the result, and even though we are the first author and corresponding author. So that's, I don't know, I hope it works, but I have some concern about that.
Yeah, I think Lionel.
Some point I've listed, they are being sometime touched upon by the panelists and people in the room. So regarding contribution of potential EuroGEO to in-situ. So trust and transparency, it has been mentioned by France. Of course, it's crucial, and this could be addressed by EuroGEO. Then I think that could be a good things to create what we call basic knowledge regarding in-situ best practices. And there we have easy, low-hanging fruit connecting existing dots. So GREX has been mentioned, but we have all relying on data management, data sharing principles. So you know that we have released a self-assessment tool, which is available on Geo Knowledge Hub. So starting with this first exercise, let's see how it applies to in-situ measurement. Then you have the requirements. Then there's already an existing contribution to move from what has been touched as well by the panelists regarding the poor encoding. So moving from CSV to very nice documented type of format that enable interoperability. And by the way, what we have done using NetCDF, so now it is vested by the DAB and available on the GeoWeb portal. So again, in practice, And all of this can be gathered in so-called basic knowledge about in-situ best practices. So creating a minimum in-situ knowledge package could definitely help. So you need to be aware of this, and this. It should be easily promoted under EuroGEO. It could be generalized, of course, to all geo as a whole. And I think it could be some, what you mentioned, small and little step by step. And it's easy. It's basically on our hand. And this basically can move the whole in-situ community forward.
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. It's very good. We also come back to the to how we could respond to this within the context of EuroGEO. I'm looking at the time; it's exactly 6. Yeah, Gregory, very quick.
Well, just a quick comment also about Alan's comment about capacity building. I remember a few years ago with Paolo, Yonan, and other colleagues, and also Mark, we had a project where we contributed to capacity building material to support data provider to provide their data into the GEOS system. So it was more satellite data oriented, but it's still alive. Right? It's the bringing GEOS services into practice workshop. We taught more than 1,000 people across Europe in providing data to GEOS. So maybe we can revitalize this material and add an in-situ component into it.
Yeah, that's something, that's one of our proposals here. Well, it's a bit here more focused on templates, but it can be guidelines, it can be awareness raising, capacity building material. That's something that I believe EuroGEO could have a role here. I think we close at 6, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, we could. I believe for all the interventions, I don't know if I think we get many messages. Maybe it was all jumping around, but I think we got many interesting ideas. Maybe Franz, the last comment for the Commission. Yeah, it should be okay.
I have because I have still a question, because my feeling is from discussions I heard, I've been in a workshop from ESA, these satellite people. My impression was they're often not aware what is there in terms of in-situ data, which is available, which has quality flex from a lot of research infrastructure, from networks like Actris, like TCON, like ICOS, where ICOS is probably not the well-known ones, but some are less well-known. So it's not, I don't believe it's to first place a technological thing that you need a broker to translate different data formats into each other. It is a matter of information and sharing of information around what is there. And we had this discussion also before. Somebody saying there's so many things there, but nobody, hardly anybody knows it because there's a lack of communication, these things. And I believe that's definitely also something where EuroGEO can play a major role in helping just distributing this information rather than providing some technological fixes to certain issues.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Of course, there is a technical interoperability component to it in certain contexts, but I think in Europe we also face, and I can see with my Copernicus in-situ hat, that sometimes it's just the entrusted entities are not really aware about the data exists, that the projects exist, and we are, for example, preparing catalogs of which activities are collecting in-situ data in the Arctic. We are also now trying to do something related to reservoir data, basically because there is a need for having this kind of an overview, and I think that could be an excellent synergy between Copernicus and the activities that we do there in-situ and EuroGEO to try to publicize, to give visibility to this kind of activities and to put it there. I think that gentleman at the end wanted to say. I forgot.
No, it's fine. Don't worry. I'll come back to that.
It's actually very short. There is a lot of awareness about in-situ with the satellite agencies, because I work in the CEOS working group, Calval, and these things are discussed on length there. But one short question, really. I was not here, maybe that was clarified at the beginning of the session, but what is your definition of in-situ? And what is the non-in-situ data called?
that we didn't enter into that definition. I applied, at least for me, the definition that we have in Copernicus program, which is basically everything which is not satellite imagery data, basically. And we typically divide, and I think, Stefan presented it nicely, also taking it from Copernicus. We divide typically the observation measurements, and we also have the typical geospatial data, which this kind of map data. But it's the definition that works so far in, at least in the context of Copernicus, of course. What we try to do beyond the discussion about terminology is just to try to provide the data that they need. We can call it, we can label it whatever, but what is important is that we try to support them with the accessing of this type of data. I think we need to close soon.
I'm just going to say quickly, one thing is the cluster of environmental research infrastructures also uses the Copernicus definition of in situ, which is basically everything that doesn't come from a satellite. And we've basically taken that from what's the generally accepted understanding. But I also wanted to come back to the issue about people being aware of data. So this is what triggered the idea of using one of the research infrastructures as a use case for how we can get better visibility of all of the research infrastructures in the cluster, which includes ICOS and Actris. And this is why, in a conversation with the Secretariat, we decided the best way to do this was to go through the whole process of what needs to be done in order to actually expose the research infrastructure's data via GEOS, and then point to this for other research infrastructures to say, this is how easy it was when you know what to do. And if there's documentation around that helps us with this process that we can share more widely, that's even better. But obviously the research infrastructures are European research infrastructures. So I think there is a role for EuroGEO here, because there are other research infrastructures outside the ENVRI cluster that have data that fills the gap. So if we can then broaden that context, I think that's another role for EuroGEO as well.
Good. I think we really need to just a last comment, because we will need to wrap up.
Okay. Do you consider the error of ground measurements? Because it's some years ago, it was saying the ground truth. There is no ground truth, but still the error exists. And one way of collecting this ground data is not enough. Because what doesn't mean that everything that is not by satellites, there are the maps that every country has of the planners, and that was from the geodesists, etc. But there is a lot of error over there because it has been done not using satellites, for instance. So all boundaries, etc., could be shifted. And so if you say, because there was, I think in Stefan, saying that biomass, in biomass, what does it mean biomass? Yes, biomass could be wet, could be dry biomass, by whom is it measured, etc. So that's a point thing, and many measurements, ground measurements, are point measurements. So point measurements are also not very good, and how to upscale it, etc., etc. So that's a huge subject like ocean, and I think it's not enough to rely on one sources. Thank you. I don't want to, but I have some experience in ground measurements, not ground truth, and I come back to the same place several times.
I think maybe if someone wants to say something very quickly, and then we really wrap up.
Since you mentioned the presentation, no, of course. I mean, I think I was attending actually a validation workshop from CEOs 2 weeks ago in the US, and there was also a discussion on what they call reference data, and of course, the more information on the error you can give, that's many times not available, but if that's possible, the better. So if you can add some information about the quality to your in-situ data, and the more you can do that, the better it is, and it is best practice to do that if possible.
Thanks, everyone. I think a big round of applause to all the panelists. And I think we will have more discussion about activities that we could do in the context of in-situ within EuroGEO. I think there are many topics that we can cover, so I think we have work for many, many years. But thanks a lot. Have a nice evening and see you tomorrow.
And thank you, Jose Miguel. Well, that sounded exciting.
Wow, that was never...
Pretty dynamic for this time of the year.
Yeah, I didn't expect that.
No, you didn't make enough for the geo because in January, by advertising,